stuff. Today we're going to be reading The Phenomenology of Spirit by Hegel. And Gregory B. Sattler here is going to be doing these comments. He has these commentaries and explanations because this is a very thick book. All right. It's very difficult to parse, especially for folks like me who's new to reading about philosophy and things like that. So I really appreciate Dr. Sattler here making these commentary videos in which he explains, how all of this stuff works and what Hegel is trying to say throughout his book. All right. So I've been reading this for the last couple of weeks. So here, this is sections 10 and 12 just of the preface. I have 4 other parts about this on my YouTube channel. But before we get too much into this, I need to see if the audio is working. So I'm going to test that out real quick. So I hear it in my headphones. Let's pull it up. On stream. Here we go. Let's see. Oh no. Looks like the audio is not showing up here.
Oh no.
Yep. All right, so like I'm gonna figure something else out. 1 second. I have to be a little ghetto today because I really want to do this. Let's try to just play it from my computer audio. See how it sounds.
That holds itself in as a sheer force without spread. And this is in no way distinguishable from superficiality. The power of spirit only is great as its expression. This is depth only as deep as it dares to spread out and lose itself in its...
So it sounds decent. Gonna go ahead and get started with this. All right. So we got our audio hooked up. Apologies if it doesn't sound great. Looks like I have somebody actually watching. It says one person. Oh no, that's probably me. Anyways, let me share the link out so people can watch. So people know I'm streaming. I'm gonna pull up my Twitch link. And then we can get this started. Even if nobody watches, I'm still going to do it because this is fun to me. I'm just that much of a nerd. But let's give people a chance to tune in. Channel. Here we go. Link copied. Posting on Discord now. Boom, bam. All right. Let's get this started. Start this over. Sorry, my screen is like behind the thing here. I have 2 screens and one's blocking the other. All right. Just for a brief little introduction, if you're jumping into this code, this section picks up off of the last sections, which we're talking about how philosophy, according to Hegel, is all about the comprehensive grappling with knowledge. right? The creation of a system and the attempts to describe the divine, or this bigger idea, this bigger feeling of consciousness of the spirit, which is kind of like the old 1800s, way of mentioning the mind. So when he says the phenomenology of spirit, what he's referring to is the soul, which was, back in the 1800s, was basically the mind, right? The conscious mind. And so this entire thing is him trying to get at what it means to be conscious, right? What it means to feel and experience life as we do from a philosophical stance. And Hegel is making an argument through this preface that, number one, a preface does not and cannot truly summarize all of which it is prefacing. And he does it in a very clever way by making this long preface talking about all the problems that he's trying to talk about and introducing all the things that he's trying to introduce. And throughout those points, making the argument that it's hard to even explain the entire, what he's talking about, because you have to read the whole book. It's like saying there's no point in making a preface because you won't understand the argument unless you read the entire argument, right? So therefore, encouraging you to read the whole book, not just look at the preface and saying, oh yeah, okay, I get what he's saying. You don't get what he's saying, right? You have to read the whole thing. But so far, he still has some incredible, bars dropped here, where he said things like many people treat philosophy like it's a tool for education, or a tool for self-improvement, a tool for, seeming fancy, right? Where he's like, people use philosophy to make themselves feel better about their belonging in the world, just like people use religion or, any other, tool of knowledge, like mindfulness, right? People use this as a form of spiritual narcissism, right? Where they're just trying to, feel good about themselves rather than actually delving deep into what it means to think on that level, and what it means to grapple with all this knowledge and all this truth and all this other, stuff. So throughout the past couple sections, Hegel was basically, introducing us to this idea that philosophy, that we should demand more from philosophy. We should demand for philosophy to tell us, or rather not to tell us, but to drive us to find that knowledge and to create an entire system, a structure of knowledge that helps us to understand and comprehend, these wider, kind of bigger picture things. And it's tough because another thing he pointed out here is that he said something along the lines of most people kind of jump on any idea, any philosophical or religious or whatever idea, like like a like a person wandering in the desert just jumps for the first chance to drink some water, right? So they treat philosophy like it's just something to parch their thirst real quick, in a deserted land, rather than, taking the time to figure out everything that can be figured out. So again, none of that probably really introduced this idea very well. This is the whole point. Like, you have to go and read this yourself. You have to go and watch these videos yourself, and I highly suggest that you do. I'll even share you the link here. So in your own time, or if you want to do that instead, you can just go ahead and just watch these videos. It's great. But let's go ahead and continue. You feel fancy, huh?
Still less must this complacency which abjures science claim that such rapturous haziness is superior to science. This prophetic talk.
Yeah, so real quick, that what he's saying here is that because in the prior sections he mentioned that philosophy is a science, or should be a science, should be treated the same as any other science. And in order for philosophy to be treated as such, you have to make it as rigorous as any other science. You can't just be like, oh yes, what about this idea, and that's cool. Yeah, no, he wants you to create a structured system, a systematic process of testing ideas and making sure they work in the real world and all this other stuff. So this is what he's saying here. You can't let it be complacent as some subset or some lesser of the other sciences.
Science claim that such rapturous haziness is superior to science. This prophetic talk supposes that it is staying right in the center and in the depths, looks disdainfully at determinateness, and deliberately holds aloof from notion and necessity as products of that reflection which is at home only in the finite.
Another great part. Yeah, this determinateness. I'm wondering what he means by that. Horos. I have some ideas because I know in that time, or was it that time, the 1800s, determinism started to, become popular and become interesting, and a lot of people were thinking about this sort of stuff. And the notion is like, the notion is getting back to that idea of the spirit or the soul, the consciousness of, or the essence of something. Back then, there's this huge idea of essentialism where people figured there was an essence that made up a certain idea or certain subject or concept, things like that.
Just as there is an empty breadth, so too is there an empty depth. Just as there is an extension of substance that pours forth as an infinite multiplicity without the force to hold the multiplicity together.
Ooh.
So there is an intensity without content, one that holds itself in as a sheer force without spread. And this is in no way distinguishable from superficiality.
Ooh. Yeah, so all of this, once again, is referring back to the idea that philosophy should not be about edification. It should not be about just random self-improvement, just kind of surface level thoughts of or philosophical thoughts and things like that, or concepts, kind of high-minded concepts, because it's superficial, right? It doesn't really hold together. It doesn't really it has this empty breath and empty death where it's not really taking you anywhere. It's not really giving you anything. It's not really teaching you anything. It's intensity without content, right? You hear that all the time when people post this fake deep tweets and things like that. It's the same concept. This intensity without content. It was like, oh yes, this is a very fascinating idea, but you're not really saying anything. You're not really teaching anybody. It's a surface level thing just to get a bunch of clicks. It seems like it's important or in depth, but it's not. It's like empty calories. It doesn't really hold. So yeah, it causes all kind of superficial.
Intensity without content, one that holds itself in as a sheer force without spread. And this is in no way distinguishable from superficiality. The power of spirit is only as great as its expression, its depth only as deep as it dares to spread out and lose itself in its exposition. Moreover, when this non-conceptual, substantial knowledge professes to have sunk the idiosyncrasy of the self in essential being and to philosophize in a true and holy manner, it hides the truth from itself. By spurning measure and definition, instead of being devoted to God, it merely gives free rein both to the contingency of the content within it and to its own caprice.
Ooh, yeah. So it looks like he's saying here, when this non-conceptual, substantial knowledge professes to have sunk the idiosyncrasy. I think I kind of know what that word means. Idiosyncrasy, like an idiosyncratic person. Like you have different kind of weird ways of describing or understanding yourself or something like that. I know it's not a good definition. It's kind of like my understanding of it. A peculiar constitution, temperament, and individualizing characteristic quality. Yeah. Kind of like esoteric, kind of eccentric type of personality. So yeah, I guess you're saying here, when that superficial, knowledge kind of pretends to explain the depth of the human psyche and if it pretends or professes to explain, you know, these eccentricities, these idiosyncrasies of the human mind, it doesn't. It falls flat, right? It hides the truth from itself, right? Oh, that's a beautiful way of saying it. It hides the truth from itself. Because it's getting in the way, right? You think, oh yes, that was a deep concept, that was a good idea there, but it's not, and it's because you're focusing on that. It's a red herring. You're not even, you're not even looking in the right direction, or you might be looking at something that seems like the truth, but because it's so surface level, it's masking the deeper, the deeper depth behind it, you know. Well, I guess that's vice versa for you, but it's interesting. It's a great way of saying it. Yeah.
Such minds, when they give themselves up to the uncontrolled ferment of the divine substance, imagine that by drawing a veil over self-consciousness and surrendering understanding, they become the beloved of God, to whom he gives wisdom and sleep. And hence, what they in fact receive and bring to birth in their sleep is nothing but dreams.
So this is the fun part. This is when, well, all of that was fun too, but this is the part where it gets a little bit easier to parse everything that Hegel was saying, right? Because as you see, it was kind of difficult to grasp, a lot of these concepts, a lot of these ideas, especially once again, if you're new to philosophy, you haven't read all these other philosophical texts and all these other people like I have, well, like I have not, like I'm inexperienced in this, so. I really appreciate Dr. Sadler here explaining these things. So let's go.
In section 10, Hegel's criticism of the philosophy of intuition, which we've been following now for several of these paragraphs, is coming to a crux. He's going to make some of the most damning criticisms, and the ones that also reveal what he's moving towards in this section. So he's continuing this sort of line, laying out what the opposed position, the position that he wants to criticize, would be saying. And he calls it rapturous haziness. That's already a little pejorative. But where's he going with this? He says that people who are doing this, they feel that this rapturous haziness is actually superior to determinacy, to the notion, the grift, to necessity, to science, to a system. And they're saying that actually they are the ones who are penetrating to the depth of things. They're the ones who...
So already, yeah, I kind of missed some of that nuance there, some of that what he was saying, that like the main drive of what he was saying there. So once again, I told you, it's great to hear this explanation. But again, this is what we see today, even today, 200 years later, right? Over 200 years since Hegel wrote this book, we still have this problem, right? Of these fake deep people, these fake woke people saying, oh yes, this is how the world works. This is blah, blah, blah. And it's like, what? No, it doesn't. But these people think that they're deeper. They think that they're so deep, that they're so, knowledgeable about everything, about the world, and they dismiss the science. They dismiss the actual systematic process of understanding how something works and understanding, the greater mechanisms and all this other stuff. And it's just wild, 200 years. He wrote this in the 1800s, the early 1800s. I think this came out in like 1807, 1809. And it's still true. That's tragic.
We have a grasp on what's most real. And by implication, what they're saying is that spirit belongs on their side. This stuff over here is not where the real show is, so to speak. That's not where real philosophy would go. That's where the philosophy of, say, Hume or Kant had gone, or sort of Kant, but not the really important stuff.
I never really read Hume or Kant, so...
This complacency which abjures science, it shouldn't claim that it's superior to science. It acts as if it's superior to science because science only deals with the empirical world. Now this is going a little bit further. Science deals with that which is determinate, that which has boundaries, that which has structure, those things that can be arranged in relation to each other. What we call discursive knowledge, discursive thinking.
Interesting.
Oftentimes you'll see people, these days, they frame this in terms of right brain, left brain, and they'll say, yeah, I'm not so much a conceptual, discursive kind of thinker. I'm not a linear thinker, they like to say. I just sort of intuitively put things together. I'm holistic. So if Hegel were around...
Real quick, I hate that because on the number... Well, I'll start with this holistic thing because it's really weird to me that the term holistic is starting to be used as a negative or pejorative idea, or like a non-important system, right? Or an idea like we said here is mostly because of those people who claim to be holistic are dismissing a systematic approach to things. Maybe I'm just misunderstanding the definition of holistic. But to me, holistic is extremely important, especially in today's time and how we think about things. Yeah, I know I'm not really talking about holistic medicine. Holism. This is why I hate this freaking types of dictionaries where they use the word to describe the word. I'm like, that's not what I'm looking for. Relating to some wholes over complete systems. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I was thinking about the correct thing. And here's why I think this is a huge problem. I know he might take this into a different direction, but I really want to talk about this. I was recently reading about determinism and looking into... I wrote an entire newsletter, first of all, 28 pages about determinism and a few other things too, but mostly determinism in the age of systems thinking. So recently I learned about systems thinking and how the world has been shifting away from a mechanistic view, over the last couple hundred years to a more systematic or more systems thinking view, right? And the main difference between that is that a mechanistic view is like kind of what Hegel was talking about, is this more determined or deterministic idea that there's a set amount of things, a set structure, and you can understand everything within that structure, right? That was the view of the world prior to the early 1900s or so, right? And much of the Industrial Revolution, the everything from the Enlightenment onwards, has even like credible folks like Isaac Newton, they did great stuff. They figured out amazing things, but much of that assumes that the world can, number one, be 100% understood, and number two, believes that you can understand the world by analyzing it, and analyzing meaning to break it down into small pieces, into the elements, elements, in order to describe or explain how the bigger picture works, right? And because it's deterministic, because it's set, that they believe that everything can be broken down into indivisible elementary parts or elementary particles, or indivisible elements, right? But when she started learning more about these elementary particles and all this other stuff, people started shifting away from that view into a systems view. This is where, look up the Russell Ackoff. I was watching his videos. This dude here. So he had some great videos talking about this whole shift from mechanistic view to a systems based, to a systems view. And he was talking about how the fact that pretty much all the laws of physics only really work in a vacuum, right? They assume to work outside of an environment, or not including an environment, not in any environment. So that means that they don't work in the real world, because the real world is environment. There is no place where there is no environment. Even in space, there's still other things interacting. And so the idea that we can completely understand the world separate from the environment, and in a complete understanding by by analyzing things and getting down to indivisible parts, indivisible elements was false, right? It's wrong. And unfortunately, I think that may be the biggest problem with Hegel, is that he's probably he's just in that time span. He's in that time where everybody thought it was a mechanistic, fully determined world. Nonetheless, he probably still has some really, really, really great points. This is why, it's great to figure out what these people were talking about, what these people were thinking, so we can figure out the good stuff, take out the bad stuff, and go on and so forth. But we'll see what he's saying here. Anyway, I got off my topic. I meant to talk about holism, but the reason why I think holistic thinking or holism or whatever is so important is because it does not assume that you can be a completely analytical thinker, right? Meaning that you can't break down things into indivisible elements and then describe the bigger thing, because the bigger thing is emergent. It's created from emergent factors, and so you can understand all the little smaller pieces, but that doesn't mean that you understand how they interact with each other to create the larger system, the larger piece. And that's the benefits of holism or of holistic thinking. It's not in these alternative ways of whatever. I'm not 100% dismissing those. We'll probably talk about that another day. But the idea of a holistic thinker is not some intuitive understanding of the world. It's, at least how I kind of understand it. I don't think it should be an intuitive understanding of, oh, I generally get what it is. But no, you can still have a disciplined approach. You can still have a systematic or a structured approach, but you also have to recognize that anything that you discover is not going to be the full story. There's probably going to be more to the story, right? And this is the most what I wrote about in my blog, in my newsletter, is that I think we can have a systems-based determinism, right? Instead of assuming that determinism has to assume that you can fully understand the system. Instead, you can have a determinism, but with the knowledge that you can't understand. You can't fully understand it, but we can always understand more, right? And so it brings you the incentive, the curiosity, the interest, the ability to keep learning more about the system and to keep building that structure, right? So every generation, there will never be an end to science. There will never be an end to learning and end to figuring everything out. We will never get to that point, but we can always get to a better point. And that's what really excites me about, learning about this stuff. But let's continue.
Hey, this would be part of what he'd be criticizing.
I just realized my mic was already back here, so sorry if my audio is not good.
They can't even give you a general idea. They can give you a word, and then after you say, well, what exactly does that word mean to you? Things start to fall apart. And the reason why this is the case is because they're actually not penetrating to depth.
Right.
They're actually espousing a point of view, which Hegel is going to say is the opposite of depth. It's actually superficiality.
Yeah.
So how is he getting to that? He says, just as there's an empty breath, not breath as in breathing, but breath as in extension, so there's an empty depth. And just as there is an extension of substance that pours forth as an infinite multiplicity without the force to hold that multiplicity together. So let's stop and look at that passage a little bit. What is he talking about there? A extension of substance. So he's using this term extension, which was quite popular in modern philosophy. And, if you think about Descartes, for example, Descartes talks about two kinds of substance, really three, because there's God. But extended substance, so bodies, everything that we can measure, and then mind, whatever that happens to be. Extended substance would be the stuff that we're seeing here, things you can sense with the senses, sight, hearing. It's really interesting to think about this in terms of computer stuff, because I'm going to take this video and process it, and I can actually see the sound waves, at least a certain representation of them, and I can monkey around with them. I can do that because that is extension in a certain respect. Now, Hegel talks about the possibility of there being extension of substance that pours forth as a finite multiplicity. So multiplicity means there's a number of different things. Finite, of course, it's not infinite. There's a certain bound to it. finite multiplicity without the force to hold the multiplicity together. No actual structure or force holding all this stuff together. It just falls apart. It becomes meaningless. It's what in Latin they would call, a heap, a molding of things. And
so I need to build that structure up.
So this is in no way different than an intensity without content. An intensity without content. So
Love
these
that.
people over here are talking about depth because they've had some sort of intuitive flash or experience, which isn't really an experience because experience would be over here, right? It's something that you just have to feel, man. What they're really
definitely
doing is they're
that.
talking about a kind of intensity that doesn't have any determinate content, that you can't actually put your finger on. That's why it's so nebulous. That's why it can mean anything that you want it to. And really, what is it ultimately based on? It's ultimately going to be based on feeling rather than thought. They think that they're having a higher thought than our ordinary, mundane, stick-in-the-mud scientific, systematic thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
But really what they're doing is they're just sort of having some hazy conceptions that are tied together with feelings, and there's no determinate content to actually anchor anything in or hold anything together in or dig in further to or share with another person in intersubjective manners. So it's something that can feel good or feel meaningful or feel deep to one, but it doesn't actually have that. It's actually superficial.
Right. Exactly what I was saying.
And
Yeah.
Hegel says
Then tweets.
The power of spirit is only as great as its expression. Its depth only as deep as it dares to spread out and lose itself in its exposition. So here's the really interesting thing. He's sort of saying, you guys have hijacked spirit over here. We're going to bring it over here, where it actually belongs. Unless you can actually articulate things in determinate ways, start arranging things. And it's not to say that you actually have to have a full-blown science or system worked out ahead of time, but unless you're being systematic in some sort of way that allows you to actually say that you're making some sort of progress, and pose some definite problems for yourself, and think of things in conceptual terms, and try to figure out what the hell's going on in terms of something must be the case, you're not really doing anything. And you're not really engaging with spirit. Spirit's actually on this side, Hegel would say, at least for now, because that is what spirit requires in order to articulate itself. And over and over and over again in the phenomenology, we're going to see what we call shapes of spirit, gestalten, shapes of consciousness, assuming some sort of determinacy that doesn't turn out to be the final story, that turns out to have some flaws in it, that turns out not to be the completed product. But spirit has to take on determinate form and shape, or else it becomes contentless, superficial. The dialectic stops, and all you're left with is kind of hazy feelings like you did something cool. So,
yeah, that's interesting. So, even though determinacy, I do think it is interesting that we can have. It is important to build this structure so that it's finally defined, right? So you can say, okay, this is the limits of what we're talking about here. However, because it can be wrong, right? It's not like it's going to. You don't have the expectation as it's going to be perfect. It's going to be a perfect explanation, but you do want to have a determinant or a kind of set boundary for what you're explaining, for what you're trying to showcase, so that you can have a conversation about it, right? So you can actually build upon it later. So yeah, I can see that, and I do agree with that. Even though I do think it's highly unlikely that we'll ever be able to fully explain, fully know the limits of what there is to know. Like we're probably going to be figuring stuff out forever, but as we do that, right, as we create this process of progressively understanding more about the universe, reality, and the mind, or the spirit, as Hegel calls it, it is useful to set those boundaries, right? It's useful to set those boundaries. So yeah, in that manner, I can see that.
So he says, when this non-conceptual, substantial knowledge professes to have sunk the idiosyncrasy of the self in essential being and to philosophize in a true and holy manner, it hides the truth from itself.
There you go.
Because what's going on over here has eschewed as beneath it, what's going on over here, it's actually deprived itself of anything that would really give it depth. And it's actually not superior to what is going on over here. The requirement to articulate itself, the requirement to measure itself, the requirement to make itself substantial. So he says, it hides truth from itself, spurning measure and definition instead of being devoted to God. What is it doing? It's merely giving free rein to the contingency of the content within it and to its own caprice. So the people that think that they're in touch with God, in touch with the real, in touch with the holy, in touch with what is most valuable, what is absolute, by doing this sort of thing, are really manufacturing their own kinds of idols, which then they feel good about, because why not? It came from them ultimately, and it's suited to them, it's measured to them.
That spiritual narcissism. Oh my gosh.
People don't get into it, and they can say, well, those other people, they're just, they're not in the know. This is where Gnosticism comes in, by the way. Total, side note. But they're not in the know. They're too stuck with, literal patterns and discursive knowledge, and they're too, I always get it mixed up whether it's left brain or right brain. But one of them is the one that's supposed to be linear and, good at figuring things out, but not very creative. We're the creative types over here. Hegel's saying, no, real creativity, real connection to what is divine, to what is most real uncovering of the potential of human being. It's not just going to take place over here. It's going to take place through this stuff.
Right.
That's not to say that this is everything. But this is not going to be something that one can just put aside or denigrate or say doesn't matter. This is going to be stuff that has to happen in order for spirit to actually understand itself, to articulate itself in time, to develop. And that's what the phenomenology is about.
Awesome. That's so beautiful. Like, we see, it's so funny because we see this every day, even to this day, once again, that people dismiss the science, people dismiss the logic and the ability to string two thoughts together in a cohesive and comprehensive way, because they're too busy trying to justify their own beliefs. They're too busy trying to be comfortable in how they feel about the world and their intuitive understanding of the world, rather than actually building out a comprehensive knowledge of the world, right? And that harms the truth itself, right? That blinds you to the very possibility of truth, because in order to find the truth, you have to do the work. You have to do the work of trying to piece together these ideas and forming that structure, creating that logic. And if you just poo-poo that, you just dismiss that idea as like, oh no, that's for those hoity-toity people, that's for academics or whatever, right? Whatever is a common, that's for liberals, I don't know, whatever is a common or the current slang for these people, like they just dismiss that, and then you dismiss your own ability to find the truth, to understand the truth. So yeah, let's I don't want to spend too much time on this.
Besides, it is not difficult to see that ours is a birth time and a period of transition to a new era. Spirit has broken a world that is hitherto imagined and inhabited, and is of a mind to submerge it in the past and in the labor of its own transformation. Spirit is indeed never at rest, but always engaged in moving forward. But just as the first breath drawn by a child after its long, quiet nourishment breaks the gradualness of merely quantitative growth, there is a qualitative leap, and the child is born, So likewise, the spirit in its formation matures slowly and quietly into its new shape, dissolving
Interesting
bit by
analogy.
bit the structure of its previous world, whose tottering state is only hinted at by isolated symptoms.
Mm.
The frivolity and boredom.
So that's the interesting, whole analogy there, comparing it to baby, and then like we're still in that fetus stage. I feel like sometimes, and that our ability to understand the mind, maybe not a fetus, maybe we're more like toddlers now. Like there's a lot more understanding of the mind and consciousness and things like that over the last couple of decades, and neuroscience and integrated information theory and all these theories of consciousness is going a lot more into describing what this experience is, this experience of life. But it still feels like there's so many people who aren't there yet, who aren't even open, or just blocking themselves from understanding that, from being able to appreciate the sheer depth of consciousness, because they have a surface level understanding of it. Yeah, I understand consciousness. I'm one with God. I'm one with the universe or whatever. But but you don't actually know what that means. You don't actually appreciate the work of the efforts of trying to understand all that, the complexities of that, all the layers that go into that. And that's really sad. That's really tragic.
Which unsettle the established order, the vague foreboding of something unknown. These are the heralds of approaching change, the gradual crumbling that, left unaltered, the face of the whole is cut short by a sunburst which, in one flash, illuminates the features of the new world.
Yeah, I think this is pretty straightforward here.
We come now to a turning point, a very dramatic turning point, where Hegel seemingly is changing the subject. He's finished with talking about the intuitive philosophy for a little while, at least. He'll come back to it later on. And now he's talking about the times again. He's approaching this in a different way.
The times they are changing.
He says that spirit is always moving on. Spirit is always progressing. So what does that mean? That means that in any given milieu, it may be, sort of stagnant spirit that has already reached the cusp of its development and isn't going to go any further, and is actually going to begin to decline and rigidify, ossify, or you adapt, you continue to change, you react to the new times, and you do so not only in a reactive way, but in a what we nowadays call proactive way, a thinking way, trying to make sense out of the new matters. He says, ours is a birth time and a period of transition to a new era. Birth time, that's a really interesting way to think about this. Something new is coming on the scene. It's not just a period of transition. We're always engaged in transitions. It's a dividing point. Something new is happening. And he's not going to tell you exactly what that is in this passage. That's coming a little bit later. I want to use this schema right here to talk about the metaphor and the basic ideas between quantitative and qualitative that he's got going on, which he say ultimately culminate in a new world, bursting out like a sunburst. Think when he says a sunburst, imagine it's a cloudy day and you're going along outside.
I kind of get this part. I'm going to speed this part up. Oops. I feel like this part is pretty straightforward here.
The sun, the clouds open up, the sun just brilliantly beams down upon you. He's talking about that sort of dramatic change. Everything is illuminated. Everything looks different in a sunburst. It may dazzle you too. You may not be able to take it in.
Razzle-dazzle.
So he talks about this as being this birth time, and he says, spirit is indeed never at rest, but always engaged in moving forward. Spirit has broken with the world that it has hitherto inhabited and imagined. And that's a very important thing to say. Not only has spirit inhabited the world that it has inhabited is partly the product of its own processes of thought, its own imagination. And its imagination is going to be liberated in this as well. Now, the metaphor that he's using is of quantitative growth of a child in the womb. You think about a baby and its development from, tiny little cells all the way to this incredible
and adding more cells, adding
thing,
more,
which is a tiny human being with a great big head. That's one of the things that differentiates us from the other animals.
Great big head.
Its organs have become developed. It's almost ready to become, as you can look at it, as free or independent of the matrix in which it has grown, which include not only the mother who's been carrying it around, but also its, I don't want to say twin, but these organs that go along with it, like the placenta. These are almost sort of like crutches that can be dispensed with. Or use the Wittgensteinian phrase, a ladder that you throw away once you climb it, which I don't think Wittgenstein actually came up with. I think that's probably from mystical literature. But you have quantitative growth, and if you were only to look at the quantitative growth, you would not be able to predict that there would be a qualitative leap. But there is. And there's a qualitative leap in all sorts of processes where the quantitative can increase as much as you want. But once it reaches a certain point, you've got something new happening. And
an inflection point.
You're in a new world. You're in a new condition.
An exponential growth hit that growth curve.
Sooner or later, the point of the qualitative growth that it's undergoing is not to just keep on growing and growing and growing, but for something radically new, something higher, something with greater possibility to occur. Consciousness. Full consciousness. The consciousness of being an independent being outside of the womb. Now, of course, you can quibble and say, well, babies aren't completely independent. They have to be changed and fed and all that. You got to kind of go with this metaphor. It's a metaphor, right? You have to think what he's trying to get at. There's a fundamental difference between a baby before birth and a baby after birth. Part of that is in the nature of the world that it's experiencing. Part of that is in the liberation of its potentials, which are going to take a long time to develop, granted. Now, why is Hegel saying this about his own time? And can we say this about our own era more than 200 years after Hegel? Hegel's saying it in part because he's writing this at the same time that the Napoleonic Wars are taking place. And you got to remember, the Napoleonic Wars are not just a dynastic struggle between European monarchs. Napoleon is an emperor, but he's the emperor of the French, who have had a massive, decades-long revolution that has seen the beheading of royalty, the banishing of the church, the replacement of all of that by a regime that was dead set on making everything totally rational, even to the extent of imposing the decimal system on days and months, which didn't work, by the way, and which had developed not only a new way of doing things and articulating politics, and even down to changing the order of military affairs, but had given people a different consciousness,
different way of thinking. Yeah.
The states in Europe could no longer feel as secure about the cultures they inhabited after the French Revolution. That's why it was such a traumatic event. Hegel was trying to make sense out of this. He's trying to say, what is the meaning of this new world that we've been thrown into?
That's a very good context. I didn't even, think about. So this is another reason why I really enjoy, watching this dude. It's interesting because, again, the context of in which we're around, our environment, right, sheds a lot of light on and rather influences a lot of how we think, right? In that time, there was so much change going on, and as we know, life was completely different after that. And today we're seeing a similar type of change, but I guess not necessarily. So we're seeing a similarly, expansive type of change. It's not the type that's the similar. It's the amount of change that's happening, right? And in our current society, we see things like automation and technology kind of completely kind of changing how we think about the world, for good and for ill. But that change is still a huge change, and it really kind of forces us to revisit our past kind of intuitions or knowledge about how the world works, and even our own consciousness, right? Like, you see more and more of us asking whether or not robots can be conscious. All right, can we create consciousness? I'm not sure if they were even thinking about that. I doubt they were even thinking about that very much in Hegel's time. But today, it's a serious kind of idea. Is like, can we create? Will Tesla or OpenAI or Microsoft, Facebook, Google, I don't know what any of these people or any of these organizations create a robot or a artificial intelligence, right, that has consciousness, that becomes conscious, which completely changes what we think about consciousness and what we think about, where it comes from and all this other stuff. So it's interesting how radical changes really influences how we think about ourselves and the types of questions that we ask about the world.
And he's going to see his own philosophy as being at sort of the center, the fulcrum of that.
Let's get it.
But this new world is no more a complete actuality than as a newborn child. It is essential to bear this in mind. It comes on the scene for the first time in its immediacy or its notion. Just as little as a building is finished when its foundation has been laid, so little is the achieved notion of the whole itself. When we wish to see an oak with its massive trunk and spreading branches and foliage, we're not content to be shown an acorn instead. So too science, the crown of a world of spirit, is not complete in its beginnings.
Ooh, hold up now. Hold up, Hegel. That's good. That's a good, that's what I was saying before. It's like we might be at the toddler stage. It's been 200 years. That seems like a long time, but in the grand scheme of time of human history, it's not that long, right? We've been creating these, or at least writing down, recording our thoughts and stuff like that for roughly a couple thousand years, 10, 15,000 years or so. We've been Homo sapiens able to think about these things for 200,000 years, right? 200 years is an extremely small amount of time in that massive amount of time. So like, yeah, as we're shifting into this new idea of what consciousness is and stuff like that, we're not going to get a full idea of it. We're not going to have a mature idea of consciousness. It's going to take a long time. That's frustrating. But at the same time, it's also very promising, very exciting, because that means at every level, we can discover completely new things, and we can make a qualitative difference in how we think about the world and like how we function in the world. Think about how, once again, a child is born, a baby, they're functioning completely differently than a 1-year-old. Like when that baby learns how to, eat for themselves, when that baby learns how to, walk, how to make noises and stuff like that. It's completely different. It just changes the game, right? And you look at that baby, you look at that child, you look at that being differently at each level, at each stage, and it completely changes its own, abilities, right? Maybe I'm taking this metaphor, this analogy too far, but maybe he might get into that. That's just so fascinating to me.
Concept of the new spirit is the product of a widespread upheaval in various forms of culture that prize at the end of a complicated, tortuous path, and of just as variegated and strenuous an effort. It is the whole which, having traversed
kind of missed that
tortuous path, the wide world of spirit is not complete in its beginnings. The onset of the new spirit is the product of a widespread upheaval in various forms of culture that prize at the end of a complicated, tortuous path, and of just as variegated and strenuous an effort. It is the whole which, having traversed its content in time and space, has returned into itself and is the resultant simple notion of the whole. But the actuality of this simple whole consists in those various shapes and forms which have become its moments, and which will now develop and take shape afresh, this time in their new element and their newly acquired meaning.
Right. Takes new shape as you grow. Each stage is a qualitative difference.
Continuing this metaphor of the new world, the new baby that has come
the
on the scene, Hegel is going to draw out for us some conclusions from that, some cautions. And first and foremost among these is, well, when you have a new child, like I just pointed out in the previous section, that child is vulnerable. That child is not yet fully developed. We're different than other animals. For example, a little deer or horse foal,
they start running and
start moving about an hour or so after it's been born and its mother is taking care of it. It's not entirely fully formed, but it's pretty much a little version of its mature parent. That's not the case for human beings. It takes us an awful lot of development, which can go off at different places and can get drawn into cul-de-sacs where development just won't take place anymore. And as we all know, babies are incredibly vulnerable creatures. Left to their own devices, they will simply die. They won't feed themselves. They will cry, because they need to be changed, because they want comfort. And they are subject to what we might call all sorts of predation, either by other animals, by diseases, by the environment itself. So we can't expect that the new world is going to come on the scene as an entirely fully developed, all of its potential, completely worked out and explored sort of entity. Instead, what we're talking about is a new world in its immediacy. And I've got this arrow here, you'll see why in just a moment. It's immediacy or its notion. Hegel uses this term notion in several different ways. Sometimes he uses it for the beginning point of something that requires to yet be worked out further, to be developed, to take determinate shape. But that too is its notion. So there's the notion at the beginning, and then there's the notion as it develops. And he says that what we're talking about here is the notion of science. Now that's kind of a weird thing to say, right? Hasn't natural science been around for quite a while by the time that Hegel is writing? After all, the modern era is really the product of natural sciences and the great advances in it from the Renaissance, actually, from some antiquity and also some of the Middle Ages. But that's, we can quibble about that sort of thing. Let's just pretend the party line. From the Renaissance on, modern science has been showing us a new way to see the world, to see ourselves, to do philosophy. Who are you, Hegel, saying that science is still in its infancy? Well, science doesn't fully understand its own business, its own process and products. And actually, if you look at the history of science, you'll see that the scientists were not always on the same page about everything. And they could get into these tiffs where, Newton and Leibniz are developing the integral calculus roughly about the same time. And, they accuse each other of having stolen the idea, Leibniz. And the British empiricists go with Newton's formulation and thereby set British mathematics behind for centuries compared to the Continentals. I mean, science is a messy business when you actually start exploring it, when you start looking at its history. So Hegel's saying science, the crown of a world of spirit. He doesn't just mean the natural sciences, and he doesn't just mean the technology that's going to be based on the natural sciences. He means the sciences across the board. So what we would also call the human or social sciences. Remember, we're talking about Wissenschaften here, not just the Anglo-American notion of sciences, the hard sciences. We're talking about the human sciences, which are always still in the process of developing and discovering and re-articulating themselves. Why? Because they're human sciences. Because they're a little bit more self-conscious about their own history and their own development. And he would also include things that we no longer call sciences, like the development of mathematics, like moral science, and that is the science of ethics. He would say that is part of the process as well.
Yeah, I think we should have that some more.
Science is not really yet fully developed in his time. It's more like the new baby that's on the scene. So he says, science.
It's probably going to continue, but I just want to say, it's interesting because that new child, that new baby kind of idea is like he says, vulnerable. And at each stage, it can be corrupted, right? It could be endangered. It could be hurt. It could be, kind of messed up. And you see so many developmental issues that pop up with humans when that happens in our own lives, in our own childhoods. Like most psychological problems can be tracked down to problems in childhood. So if you think about this in relation to this analogy, could a similar thing could have happened to our science? Could a similar thing could have happened to our ability to create this new idea of consciousness and everything like that? Could that have been corrupted or destroyed or, kind of messed up along the way, along its development in the last 200 years? Is it still in that process? Something to think about.
Science, the crown of the world of spirit, is not complete in its beginnings. The onset of the new spirit is the product of a widespread upheaval in various forms of culture, the prize at the end of a complicated, tortuous path of just as variegated and strenuous an effort. Hegel's saying there's a lot of stuff going on in my own time that people have been putting things to the experiment. Think again about the French Revolution and this notion that we're gonna change society itself. That was not just about natural science. That was about what we call social science, about psychology, sociology. These things, even before they had names, people are working in them. And Hegel's saying all of this stuff is going on, but it's going off this way and this way and this way and this way and this way. And not everybody is on the same page. And they're actually arguing with each other about quite a few of these things. Great example in his own time, theory of color. Goethe had one theory of color. Newton had another theory of color. They're both quite interesting.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Newton, but there's certain things about Goethe's theory of color that actually make quite a lot of sense.
You might have to look that up.
Hegel's saying, in order for it to really be science, in order for it to truly be knowledge, it has to be unified. It has to be a process by which rational beings are coming to know about this thing that they call knowledge and the objects of knowledge, which include themselves, which include the knowing subject, and include what connects the different realms of knowledge to each other. Now, that is just in its infancy. And it's a good question about whether it remains in its infancy in our time as well. So he says, what's going to happen with this? And I put this question mark here. Hegel talks about this in terms of immediacy. And whenever you see that immediacy, don't just think about what is right on the scene, immediately on the spot. Think about a lack of mediation, a lack of something else which supplies context, which supplies explanation, which supplies our understanding of things. And there's going to be a lot of different things.
That's an interesting.
What are we going to move to from the notion?
Understanding of that word.
Mediation.
Mm.
Immediacy, we call it. That means that when we are actually working in a truly philosophical, scientific manner, things are always going to be mediated. There's going to be no sort of raw, we can start here, and this is completely taken for granted starting points that we're going to be able to work with. This is sort of a side note, and this is something that will come up a little bit later on. There's something else that's going on in this passage that's very important that ties in with this whole notion of birth and development. He says that it's the whole, the totality.
Hold up. I'm just, because it's still kind of bogging my mind. Can I pause this? There you go. This immediacy thing, hold up. This is kind of distracting me now. I realized it was related to, immediacy to. I might look up the etymology of immediacy. I have the breakdown of the sources. Etymology. Maybe that's just a translation thing, because the whole thing was written. Hegel is German. I think he wrote it in German. Yeah, that's why I'm kind of familiar with it. I guess that's kind of what he means too, right? Like you're getting close to that to the proximity. So not just a time thing. It's not just it's here. It's we're getting closer. It's a approaching type of thing. I don't know. Interesting.
Having traversed its content in space and time, so it's got content, right? Determinate things. There we go. And these have been changing in space and time. Some of these didn't exist and then begin to exist. Some of these go off the scene. And the entirety, the whole, traverses itself through space and time, traverses all of these content. It returns into itself and becomes the resultant simple notion of the whole, of the totality, of the all, of the everything.
The all.
I said, what the hell is he talking about here? Where we're headed with this is bringing in the subject, bringing in the thinking subject as part of this process. We're the ones that are able to grasp the whole or the totality as such. And we are part of that very whole. And when we think about this, at first we form a simple notion of it, something which is not yet developed. And so we're usually going to do this by taking some particular kind of content and focusing in on that. But really, strictly speaking, we should be focusing on everything at the same time. It's very difficult to do, isn't it? So he says, the actuality of this simple whole consists in those various shapes and forms which have become its moments, which will now develop and take shape afresh, this time in their new element, in their newly developed meaning. So what he's talking about there is saying that each one of these has undergone a process of some sort of development through human history, and that we're now at a point whereby grasping the whole and grasping the entire process of development, we can see what happened with each of these. We're in a position to see better than the people who were involved in the French Revolution just what was going on, what the real meaning of the revolution was vis-a-vis the whole. They were not able to have a full perspective on it because it was still developing.
See in retrospect, right?
Where we can at last have a truly scientific understanding of all of human development in politics, law, art, religion, philosophy, culture, all technology, all these sorts of things. Now, you can debate whether Hegel is at such a point where he can make such a claim, but Hegel certainly thinks that he is there. And
that's the thing, right? In our time, in one's time, you always think that you're at like an apex, because in some sense you are, right? You're in the present time, according to you. But as time progresses, we go back and realize, oh wow, we were wrong, right? There was a lot of things that were still in development, or things that were not even thought of at that time, right? So of course Hegel would think, that's what's going on in his time, that you have this perfect moment of being able to understand all these, fully developed ideas, or at least ideas that are developed enough to develop a, more a convergent explanation of things. And but I feel like, or rather, we are many people today will probably make the same argument, right? Whether or not we're right about that will be yet to be determined. We'll be able to know in 100 years or more. But that's what makes it so interesting. And again, it's a process, right? At each step of the way, you can create a more convergent idea. You can look back at everything that was before and develop something that seems to you to be more comprehensive. And maybe you can do so with the knowledge that in the future somebody else will figure out something that's even more comprehensive. But for this moment in your time, in this present time, whatever that is for you, you have to believe that you can develop a comprehensive, a system that you're living in a time when all the other past, things were still in development, and now you have a perfect time where you can bring it all together. So yeah, very interesting.
And this is central to his project.
That was it. But yeah, that's it. Beautiful stuff. This is why I love this freaking series so much. This book is really amazing. Don't start another one. Don't. I said no. Goodness. So yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. I know this was long. It wasn't as long as the last one, so kudos. I guess maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. But this was great. Let me hide that. Hello. So yeah, as always, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think. This will be on YouTube, so you can go back and listen to it, watch it, see the other ones that I had up here before, and have a great day. See ya. Bye bye.